This week in Pediatric Oncology, the podcast exploring hot topics and exciting advances in childhood cancer. TWiPO is produced by Solving Kids Cancer, nonprofits located in New York and London dedicated to improving research and supporting families, because every kid deserves to grow up. Subscribe to TWiPO through your favorite podcast platform.
This week in Pediatric Oncology, the podcast about new advances for childhood cancer. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 95, recorded on January 27th, 2022. I'm your co-host, Brenda Weigel from the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. I'm here along with my co-host, Dr. Tim Cripe from Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, affiliated with the Ohio State University. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Brenda.
And today it is actually my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce two, I'm going to call them rock stars of solving kids cancer. And it really will highlight some amazing insights from the patient advocate point of view with regards to pediatric drug development. They teamed up with many other advocates to publish just in the last few weeks in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, When Innovation and Commercialization Collide, a patient advocate view. Today, we are joined by Donna Ludwinski and Nick Bird. I am just so thrilled to have both of you here. For some of you, they don't require introduction, but for some they do. Donna is active as a research advocate in solving kids cancer for the last many years, since her son Eric died of neuroblastoma at the age of 24 in 2010, having been originally diagnosed in 1991. She serves on the National Cancer Institute Pediatric Central Review Board, is the FDA patient representative for advisory committees. She is a member of the New Approaches to Neuroblastoma Therapy, also known as NANT, Parent Advisory Council, and a former member of the board of directors of CAC2, which is also known as Coalition Against Childhood Cancer. Donna has a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering and lives in West Virginia with her husband, Paul. She enjoys time with their 3 grown children, their spouses, and 6 grandchildren. Nick Bird. Nick is now the chair of the Board of Trustees of Solving Kids Cancer UK. He is the father to Adam, who was diagnosed in 2009 with high-risk neuroblastoma that was ultimately chemo-refractory, and he underwent treatment in the UK, Germany, and the United States. Unfortunately, dying of his disease in 2013 at home with his family. Nick is also a former member of the UK National Cancer Research Institute Children's Cancer Group and currently serves as a member of their neuroblastoma subcommittee. He is chair of the Innovative Therapies for Children with Cancer, also known as ITCC Advocate Committee, and parent and public voice partner for the NHS England Clinical Reference Group for Children and Young People's Cancer. Nick lives in Epsom with wife Allison and Adam's 2 siblings, Jacob and Jessica. And welcome. And so, Nick, I am fascinated by what led you to want to really start addressing these issues around innovation and commercialization of, particularly in this case, looking at neuroblastoma therapy. But what moved you to pull this together and really come out with such a strong voice for the patient and family?
Well, thank you for the introduction. I guess it was a combination of things, actually. And like a lot of things, it wasn't a single moment in time. It was a journey to get there. So actually, Adam was in Europe, was one of the children who was treated on the initial feasibility study of dinutuximab beta in Germany. And so that was where I personally first came across kind of anti-GD2 therapy as one of the first parents to enroll their children in Europe. And then in 2016, during the NICE appraisal of Unituxin by United Therapeutics in the UK, I was a patient expert on that process, which ultimately led to NICE rejecting Unituxin And then together with Donna and two other parents, SKC, we lodged an appeal against the NICE decision to not approve Unituxin. And that was the first time that a charity had actually unilaterally appealed a decision by NICE. So unbeknownst to us, United Therapeutics were unable to supply the drug into Europe. And so although that appeal was successful, they withdrew their marketing authorization. That was my first foray into digging deep into anti-GD2, and then came the approval of dinutuximab beta by the EMA and subsequently by NICE, of which I was a patient expert. And then in 2018, I was invited to the multi-stakeholder Accelerate conference in Belgium to present the history of anti-GD2 as one of the few drugs that was approved and licensed in children. Obviously, that required a ton of research to understand, the near 3-decade history of anti-GD2 therapy, all the way through ultimately to FDA and EMA approval. And I shared the stage that day with Dr. Crystal Mackel, who was talking about cell therapy, and I guess presenting then with approved therapies. And at the time, there were a number of clinical trials ongoing within North America, but there was only one funded and as yet to open study in Europe. The issue of now being able to use drugs that are approved and licensed and reimbursed, obviously in frontline therapy, to continue to innovate, that's really where it first cropped up. And then if we fast forward, becoming more involved in some of the Accelerate initiatives, pediatric strategy forums, and just reflecting on some of the conversations around CAR T cells, with Kymriah being, again, approved either for refractory patients or patients who have failed two prior relapse therapies, and the continued innovation in neuroblastoma with chemoimmunotherapy, which again, Europe is and was behind North America in terms of momentum taking that forward. And it occurred to me that there were two things at play here. One, within neuroblastoma itself, the ability to move chemoimmunotherapy forward as rapidly as possible to benefit children with neuroblastoma. And on the back of that, because of GD2 being a good target in neuroblastoma and CD19, obviously in acute lymphoblastic leukemia, it's a case study of what I think will be issues that will affect other pediatric cancers when promising new agents, finally are uncovered in those diseases. So that's really the two motivations.
So Nick, I want to compliment you on not only all the effort and success you put into sort of moving that through and becoming aware of all the processes and the challenges and limitations, but also sharing them with the rest of the community in this publication. I'm an academic pediatric hematologist oncologist. Through your paper, I realized that those of us in academia, when it comes to drug development, we think very differently than those in industry. And so, Donna, I see, before COVID, would see you at all the academic meetings all the time in various places, including Australia and other places. And then you also live in the FDA world, being on the advisory committees. So can you tell us maybe a brief summary from your paper, what the differences in that you've seen, how academics think in terms of drug development and planning studies, and how much of what we do as academics may not even count toward the FDA approval of a drug, because that's ultimately all of our goals. So we really need to align those approaches.
Well, I thank you, Tim. That is a great question. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term post-hole history, where you just take one thing and you learn about that one thing, from beginning to end. I think this case study, so to speak, is a good example of post-hole, because it's a holistic look from beginning to end, and really questioning what does the future look like, and drawing out some of these considerations. Whereas academics, obviously, you're juggling, first of all, a bunch of different diseases, any number of agents that are potentially promising. And then you throw combinations in there and the permutations become infinite, right? So I think it would be a tall stretch for an academic to really be thinking about what happens after a drug is approved and even their role in getting to that approval because of all of the other things that are going on simultaneously. So I think maybe that's a good example of where the advocate, who can be pretty head down focused, in particular, a case like this, to really look deeply into that and question what's going on. So because Nick and I have worked together for many, many years, and by the way, everything Nick does in the advocate world is purely volunteer. So I always, I still can't believe how much he's able to accomplish, with a real job on the side. But the thing is, because we're so closely aligned in terms of understanding what's going on, on both sides of the Atlantic, we see what is essentially terrible disparities between what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the US. So if you look at just the sheer number of combination studies that are going on with a drug like dinutuximab and compare that to Europe, it's just shocking. So every day we're seeing examples of something that looks like there's very good data behind it. The chemoimmunotherapy combination that's talked about in the paper is pretty well established. I mean, the data was first released in 2016. Now, fast forward 6 years later, children in Europe aren't able to get that at all, even though there's a very, very good rationale and data set behind that. So as advocates, we're calling this out and saying now, what can we do about this, and what can we do to potentially incentivize, or is it a carrot or a stick, with industry to make sure that they make these drugs available for further innovation. Nick is intimately aware of how difficult it was getting dinutuximab beta available for any studies in Europe, after the one indication that they have, and it's a very frustrating process. So all that said, I think it's a good time to pause and kind of think through this, longitudinal.
I mean, the intention of when publishing, or when we tried to submit it to JCO to get it published, as advocates, if you have a message, you're only as good as being able to deliver your messages to the audience that you want to hear them. And in this case, it was the academic clinical research community, but also it was industry, it was regulators, because I think the solution to this, and I kind of use the word solution advisedly, as in to make things more effective and more efficient, is genuinely a multi-stakeholder process. And so, if you look at, for example, chemoimmunotherapy in the United States, that's been, there's been hundreds of children who have been treated with that combination, and yet, because of the limitations in the way that the studies themselves were conducted and the data was collected, United Therapeutics have been unable to get a license expansion for that patient population. And whilst these things happen, and that study, those studies were instigated almost a decade ago, the point is to learn from the past and not repeat that in the future, whether that be in neuroblastoma or in some other disease. And then in terms of Europe, I think there are particular challenges within Europe, because although, and I say this as somebody from the UK who is now no longer under the auspices of the European Medicines Agency, but in Europe, you have regulators, the EMA and MHRA in the case of the UK. But then once a drug is approved by the regulator, it still needs to be approved by each health technology assessment agency for reimbursement within each country. That's still a national competency. So there are whole swathes of challenges in order to take a drug, deliver the clinical trial that's going to generate the scientific evidence that in your world might make it standard of care. But of course, it's not standard of care unless it can be prescribed for for patients on national healthcare systems.
Building on that, and you alluded to this, is that you really are using sort of the neuroblastoma story for chemoimmunotherapy as a model, as a lesson learned for sort of how we can think about moving forward for other types of agents. And you mentioned, Kymriah, you mentioned other things potentially in that mix. Do you feel there are key steps that would enhance our ability to learn from these past challenges with neuroblastoma? And building on sort of what Tim was saying is, how can we in the academic community and you in the advocacy community and then the regulators and the pharma industry really take actionable steps to learn from this as we move other therapies forward?
So you're asking me the simple questions.
I did ask you a super simple question. And it's partly, if we're going to take steps forward in lessons learned, what do you think are some of those key things that may be happening, or certain things that we can build on to try to learn from this experience, recognizing we're all in different areas?
I mean, I think in terms of, there are a bunch of challenges, obviously, in terms of clinical trial design. I think we say in the paper that from the outset, clinical trials have to satisfy, all the stakeholders. Clinical trials have to satisfy, that they have to be scientifically robust to satisfy the academic clinical research community, but they also have to satisfy the criteria required of regulators and of payers. Early engagement of those different, and as it says, planning for successful trials, because ultimately, we want these trials to succeed and we want effective drug to become available to children. So that's one thing. The problem of being able to get hold of high cost drugs and use them in clinical trials is an issue in and of itself. These conversations are moving forward, as we said in the paper, within the Accelerate multi-stakeholder platform to try and figure out what might be some of the best solutions around this. Because chemoimmunotherapy, for example, when chemotherapy is standard of care, then adding a novel agent to chemotherapy in relapse refractory setting is the typical way of evaluating that novel agent. But if you have a drug which is approved and reimbursed for frontline standard of care, but it's not approved and reimbursed in a relapse refractory setting, how can you still get access to it to use it as a backbone to evaluate the addition of new novel agents? It's those kind of challenges that we need to find solutions to that work for, first and foremost, that work for children, so that children are gaining access as rapidly as possible to promising new therapies. But obviously that work for the researchers, for industry. Donna, I don't know if you've got anything to add on.
Yeah, I think, you brought up the payers, and that multi-stakeholder approach, to tackling this huge problem, it's key. And I don't know that we've reached that status where the payers are involved in these conversations, because obviously it's a massively different situation in the US, where drugs can be prescribed off-label. Data may not be collected at all on those children, and so you can have this just enormous lost opportunity to prove that is actually something, there's meaningful data there. But whereas in Europe, you simply can't do that. And as Nick pointed out in the paper, it's sketchy at best, to try to access these. So I think, Nick, when you were saying, it has to be a multi-stakeholder, but there may be value in having, advocates who are really interested in that particular drug or that particular disease, or even the treatment pathway, because, in this situation, you've got now different elements to be looking at, potentially the same combination. Do you do it in frontline? Do you during induction? Do you do it during the maintenance phase, there's a trial going on right now with, standard immunotherapy, or do you do it only in the relapse and refractory setting? So you've got all of these different spots to look at, as well as all these different potential combinations. So I think early discussions and potentially involving advocates, as well as, obviously industry has to be involved in those conversations. It's their drug, but maybe, and then how we bring in the payer question, I don't know, but I think it's really important.
Now, going back to the issue that the academic versus industry, and let alone the difference between Europe and the U.S. and all the constraints that may be in one or the other place. When we think of doing a clinical trial in academics, okay, we think, okay, we're going to either pitch an idea to industry and they're going to run it, and we can we run the trial, but they sponsor it and pay for it and everything. That's sort of the gold standard. And then everything would be fine, right? They have all the data. They can help design it the way they need it. But most of the time, it seems like we're either convincing them to just give us the drug or cross-reference their IND for a new trial, in which both of which they may not be involved with the design at all, or we write a grant or to some agency or NIH or others to propose a clinical trial of a drug that's out there, but for a new either indication or a new application or a new combination, may or may not require an IND. But in many of those cases, the company isn't interested in becoming involved until we show them some really good data. And if we do, maybe they will get involved. But until then, they may not. We may be doing this on our own, in which case industry is not involved in the trial design, the biomarkers being studied, or the data that's collected. And so after reading your paper, I'm like, well, it seems like all that work is sometimes wasted. I mean, not usable.
Right.
So
and Tim, I did a quick search in PubMed to look at 30 years. How many clinical trial publications were there? It's easy to, trim it down to just clinical trials. Pick an indication like neuroblastoma. Over 700 trial papers are in 30 years, but how many drugs are used in frontline, new drugs? I mean, it's a glaring way to quantify what you just said, which is a lot of trials. We know there are a lot of early phase trials in pediatric cancer, but how many of those, march forward and actually change the way that that disease is treated? And we know that there's a woeful lack of new therapies, and there is something in that system that things are getting lost somehow. I mean, if there were incredibly efficacious agents or combinations, for whatever reason, those are not moving forward for the most part. I mean, it's a generalization, but for the most part.
What's the answer? Should we always get industry involved right away at the beginning of an idea, but maybe they're not engaged, or they don't have the bandwidth or don't want to yet? We think it's a great idea, so we want to move it forward somehow.
I think Nick's point about planning for success requires that conversation with them, because if you start with the what if this is, this going to produce good data and it's going to be fit for filing? What is industry's role and commitment, to advancing that drug for that disease? And it takes careful thought to think through. I feel it takes careful thought to look at exactly what indication it is, because some of the drugs that have been approved have narrow indications, like Nick brought up Kymriah. When is that ever going to be used for children diagnosed with leukemia today? And that's a huge question, right? So the indications might be pretty narrow and kind of a small subset. You have to think through, how is it still going to advance so that something that's great is going to be applicable to more situations.
I think you raised the issue as well that I think is critical, that in the academic world, when you're thinking about a clinical trial and you're thinking about moving something forward, there's a real scientific intent. So you're being driven by maybe really looking at the science and not thinking necessarily about how can I design this to actually meet a regulatory requirement, ultimately making the drug or treatment available more widely in the future. Because I think, and so I also think that mindset of really understanding what's required on the regulatory side. And I think that what you demonstrated beautifully, Nick, in the manuscript is that was an afterthought, and a big afterthought, for the development of the targeted GD2 therapies, that ultimately some of that data could never be produced that you needed. And I think there is that real lack of understanding, but also engagement with regulatory authorities early on that goes beyond the industry piece, because if this trials are being done through collaborative groups like ITCC, the Children's Oncology Group, they may be accessing a drug not necessarily in conjunction and partnership with a pharma partner. It may be through some other type of access. So I think, and I don't know if you want to comment on, as advocates, how can we facilitate potentially engagement very early on of sort of understanding that regulatory landscape?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is, obviously we co-authored the manuscript, but as advocates, we are still learning more and more every day, and our thoughts and views are formulating every single day. And especially when you consider, as an advocate, I could purely specialize in regulatory science and in HTA processes, etc. But it's just something that we dip in and out of because of time constraints. I do think, and again, this is evolving, so that's kind of why I qualified it. I do think that what you said, and both Unituxin and Qarziba were obviously approved on the back of academic clinical trials that were initiated without any drug company support. The NCI manufactured the drug for the 0032 study, and CIPN themselves instigated manufacture of dinutuximab beta for the CIPN studies. And when it comes to regulators and reimbursement agencies holding academic clinical trials to the same standards of industry without there being government agency support to bring that infrastructure and the monitoring, etc., up to the level that's required. And certainly in my experience with NICE, for example, there was no, I don't want to say appreciation, but there was certainly no leniency for the fact that this trial was conducted in a 200 plus cooperative group, multi-institution setting, and all the challenges that comes with conducting those studies in rare patient populations, just in order to try and get the kind of scientifically valid data. So I do think it is an ongoing evolution and education, and trying to raise, if you like, the understanding and appreciation of what's required of academic clinical trials, but also on the part of government agencies, of regulators, to make sure that the tools and the support is in place to enable those kind of studies to be conducted, because actually companies, like you say, may not want to take things forward or commercialize drugs until, they're practically handed it on a plate and gift wrapped, and it all has to be there and in a form that's going to deliver for the regulatory agencies and reimbursement.
I think one exciting piece of this is already near complete, and that is the Fit for Filing group with Accelerate spent a couple of years discussing this in depth. And so you have an advocate, but you have the academics and you have the regulators, both from the US and Europe, and industry people putting together a nice piece to really educate all of us on those different perspectives and different roles with that you come into Fit for Filing studies. And that paper's been submitted to JCO. So it should be coming out soon. And the goal of the group is to continue on educating, especially for the academics they're the scientists, they're the ones, wanting to see what is tested and is tested in a meaningful way in children, but to take that, that question a little further and saying, well, what if this works, and what's required for the studies. And one of the simple conclusions so far that has already been quite obvious, when Nick is referring to, the data quality, it requires more resources. So who's going to pay for that? And so the idea of really kind of pushing the envelope when industry is partnering on these studies to make sure that the resources are there, and not leaving it to the academics to have to come up with bigger budgets, to run these trials, when it's for the company's good to have that data available for potential filing. So I think that's a big step forward in this whole conversation, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that takes this and advances it.
So we've gone farther over time than usual. Believe it or not, I mean, it seems like we just started talking, but I also think this is a conversation that needs to continue in many different forums over much longer time, and hopefully this podcast will serve as a instigator of such conversations amongst all the different kinds of stakeholders you've described. But I think we're going to need to wrap it up, unfortunately. But maybe Brenda, do you have any last questions for our guests?
I wouldn't say a question. I just will say a comment of thank you for starting this conversation. I think we are starting, and I think there's a long road ahead. I look forward to seeing sort of the next publication, the Fit for Filing, coming out in JCO, and then really kind of looking back and saying, having another conversation. Have we moved forward? Have we learned from this? And are we doing better? And so it's a real opportunity to continue the conversation. And I thank both of you immensely for that.
I think that, you wrapped it up perfectly, because that was and is the intention of publishing the manuscript, is to instigate those conversations.
Well, thank you for doing that. And we're sorry for both of your losses, but grateful that you're really turning them into something positive for other people. And we know, I know that you've enlightened me, not over the years for Donna, for sure, but certainly from this paper, and will continue to enlighten our whole field. So thank you for all your work.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Yes. So that's it. Thanks to the rest of the teams as well for Solving Kids Cancer, both here and abroad. Solving Kids Cancer is a nonprofit charity dedicated to improving survival through creating novel treatment options for children. Remember, the more we learn, communicate, share ideas, and work together, the faster we'll reach the day when all childhood cancer is preventable or curable. As always, keep up the fight, and thanks for listening to This Week in Pediatric Oncology.
We welcome your comments, questions, or thoughts on topics for future episodes. Just drop us a note at TWiPO@solvingkidscancer.org. You can follow Dr. Cripe on Twitter at KidsOncDoc. Send an email to Dr. Weigel at weige007@umn.edu, and find all TWiPO episodes at solvingkidscancer.org.